Hi everyone, welcome. As you can see, I've already got a tray full of food and my glove on. I'm all set to feed these African nightcrawlers, these 171-day-old systems that have been fed 15 times so far. That last check-in 13 days ago was not terribly unusual, but a little bit out of the ordinary because what we had to do, we didn't have to, but what I ended up doing was extracting some of the foods that they had been given during the previous check-in, foods that didn't go anywhere and were actually attempting to grow within the worm bins. So for those of you that were with me 13 days ago for that feeding might remember these chunks of Savoy cabbage, which in certain places were starting to show little shoots growing, little bits and pieces of growth showing, which just told me that I hadn't left this stuff in the freezer long enough. So the first thing I did, as soon as we finished that last check-in with these guys 13 days ago, was that I returned all this cabbage to the freezer. So almost 2 weeks of additional time spent in the freezer is hopefully enough to stunt any further growth that these bits of cabbage might have thought they would want to do once they would be reintroduced to warmer temperatures and a place to possibly try growing. So the other thing that occurred during that last check-in 13 days ago was that, well, maybe it's just me looking for another excuse to see more of that stuff keep growing, was that we took out the stuff that wasn't growing and we replaced it with even more bits of Savoy cabbage that I had, which had hopefully been in the freezer long enough to prevent it from wanting to grow. So I suppose we'll see once we explore the feeding zones. You can see we used a lot of nice leafy matter out here on the surface to coat the systems with material that I assume the worms would appreciate. Over here I hardly see any of it. It almost seems like perhaps it's been getting consumed by the worms, and here in bin number 1 I could see perhaps a little bit more. Maybe I just wasn't consistent in the application of it. So let's see, we also gave them banana peels besides the chunks of Savoy cabbage, but the chunks that we put in last time were almost like if you were to take I think I had a half of a head of Savoy cabbage, which I simply chopped in half. So I think basically each system got a quarter of a head of cabbage, which, like I said earlier, hopefully got frozen enough to the point where it would not just attempt to remain in the worm bin and try to grow. And it was a pretty good size, substantial piece of material, of which I believe I just found a chunk of it here. No signs of any growth. Just a very little tiny core of it here, loaded with worms. So I think we did actually give them Savoy cabbage last time that was in fact primed for worm bin consumption appropriately. So now with the extra 13 days that these refrozen pieces received, I assume that we're gonna not see any further growth of Savoy cabbage in these systems going forward. And the banana peels that we threw in here, those are another sort of thing that you would probably see leftovers of, because banana peels are a pretty tough, fibrous substance that the worms definitely enjoy, but they do need to work on it a little bit to make it vanish. And here I can already see the stem of one of the banana peels pretty heavily worked. These worms have been busy, and it's funny, here at the base of the stem where it connects up to the peel, I could see worms ducked in there, and it almost seems like if I were to burst this thing open, yep, not too surprising, the worms have crawled down into the stem. It is interesting that the stem of a banana is as juicy as it is. All those tough fibers surrounded by juice are something that the worms definitely like to go for. So even though it takes a little bit longer, the banana peels are also a fairly popular item, as is the cabbage, as you noticed. Those nice big quarter heads of Savoy cabbage have all been eaten, or at least here in bin number 1 have all been eaten. I think we might have put 2 or 3 banana peels in each system, so we were pretty generous with the banana peel. So it wouldn't be surprising to find more of it in here. Here we go. Quite popular, as you could see, and all getting worked down considerably by these wormies, because sometimes when I come back into a system, even after 13 or more days, like we're seeing here, the banana peels sometimes have a tendency to stick around, but here it seems like the worms have done a number on this stuff. I got a feeling that the fact that the temperatures are increasing gradually, although over the past few days it's been a kind of a chilly stretch of weather rolling through my region. The overall trend has been warming, I believe, and I think that that might in itself be a catalyst for increased worm activity. I guess because the worms aren't just struggling to keep themselves warm, they're comfortable and keeping themselves busy by nourishing themselves by breaking down the foods that we give them. So now that we had a chance to sort of explore and get a chance to get caught up with what's transpired in these systems over the past 13 days, I believe it's fair to expect just more of the same as we come over here in bin number 2, and for that reason I'll generally pick up the pace a bit, unless of course we encounter something very out of the ordinary. So here's a banana peel which has survived a little bit better, and that might just have to do with the fact that it looks like it got folded over on itself without as much of the juicy inside of the peel being exposed. It was mainly the outer portion of the peel that was facing outwards. But worms definitely got into it and worked it down. Here too, another pretty good size remaining piece of banana peel. But I'm more interested in how they did with the cabbage. And I thought that I had encountered something that I thought might have been the cabbage, but I kept going because maybe it didn't really look so much like it after all. But who knows, perhaps the worms in this bin were just more interested in cabbage than banana and did away with it. So I guess we'll probe around a little bit more to see if we find any leftovers of the Savoy cabbage in here. But you got to admit, the part that we found over in bin number 1 was pretty puny. And it was, I guess a good portion of its size isn't even cabbage, it's just worms. Yeah, look at that. In fact, it's almost all worms. So perhaps I overestimated how much leftover cabbage there remained in bin number 1. There really isn't much. But it was kind of cool that we got back in here in time to witness a little piece of the leftover and also get a chance to see how much the worms are enjoying it. But if you ask me, the cabbage here in bin number 2 has, for the most part, if not entirely, been consumed, unless I completely missed it, which I suppose is always a possibility too. So let's get to feeding these little guys. I've got 2 more days of coffee, as you saw, to give them today, which comes along with brand new replacement coffee filters, meaning we can use the ones that had been previously set up as our feeding zone indicators as supplementary bedding down here in the feeding zones. And I guess we'll return all these leftover bits of this and that, which we encountered along the way, to the feeding zone so I don't forget. And then in can come today's lovely portion of a second try at giving them Savoy cabbage. So these bits right here are the stem end, which are the most likely to keep growing, it seems. So we'll try to divvy that stuff out fairly. And then the rest of this stuff is an assortment of other things. I think there's parsley, there's bits of cucumber, some radish, an assortment of different other stuff in here. And I tried to line my plastic container with some paper towel just because some of this food seemed like it would begin thawing and possibly try sticking to the plastic container, which I didn't want to see happen. So that's the reason for that little piece of paper right there that came along with the foods. And I've got additional bedding we can throw in here, but let's complement the food with some grit. The grit that I generally use, or almost exclusively use. I don't remember ever using anything other than pulverized eggshell as my grit in my worm bins. And oh boy, that was a tragedy averted for this little tiny worm. Must have been stuck to my glove, so when I did that little bump with my glove, I transferred this little itsy bitsy worm to the container in which I store the grit. So luckily I somehow caught that out of the corner of my eye before that little guy ended up in a compromising situation. So let's backfill. Oftentimes I'll use the backfilling of the feeding zone to reach out furthest away to bring in materials from the outer edge. Sometimes I'll just leave those outer edges undisturbed simply because I don't want to become too much of a creature of habit. But if you were to classify one of my worm bin management activities as kind of routine, it's this. Trying to use the backfilling of the feeding zone as a reason to bring in materials from the outside while at the same time aerating everything in the bin for the most part and giving us a chance to inspect how things are looking. If you ask me, things are looking really nice in both of these systems. It was really nice to see how they did with the cabbage that we gave them last time, stuff that did actually get frozen adequately so that it could simply be utilized by the wormies as a food substance, unlike the portion of cabbage that had been given to them the previous time. So note to self, make sure things that have a tendency to want to grow, once they're placed into the worm bin, have been sufficiently frozen before being fed. I think the other main culprit in that category is potato, with which I've had past experiences. So I've kind of learned by observing on numerous occasions the persistence of certain foods that want to just keep on growing once they've been placed into the worm bins. And you know, before we get too far along with covering things up, I also bought in my supply of leaves here. It's not a whole lot, but I like the way things look when we first got in here. The way the worms were making use of the stuff on the surface as possibly a food substance as well, because it did seem like a good bit of it was missing over in bin number 2. In bin number 1, it seemed like we had a certain amount of it remaining. And you know, another thing, I do see a little flying insect out here in my face, and something I've been doing in a lot of my systems, which I have a suspicious feeling that might actually be working, is the treatment with the Mosquito Dunks, which I nowadays store in a powdered dry form rather than mixing it into a solution. And the one thing I just don't want to see happen is an outbreak of flying insects in my worm bins, because it just becomes a nuisance. They're all over the place. I mean, most people I would assume are in the same boat as me when it comes to not liking that. I don't think anyone likes having flying insects greet them when they go in to check in on their worm bins. So there we go. At the very last moment, I've taken my clean hand and soiled it. Silly me. No big deal. Off to the sink with that. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.